Lester Holt is one of those people. For decades, he sat behind that anchor desk at NBC Nightly News, calm, composed, unshakable. The kind of man who could deliver the most devastating news on earth and somehow still make you feel like the world wasn't completely falling apart. That steadiness wasn't just a skill. It was something deeper, something that took years to build and even longer to carry. But here's the thing about armor that most people forget. The stronger it is, the heavier it gets. At 66 years old, after a lifetime of carefully chosen words and an even longer lifetime of carefully guarded silence, Lester Holt finally said something. Not in a headline, not in a press conference, not through a publicist or a carefully managed interview. He said it the way a man says something when he has waited long enough, quietly, deliberately, with the full weight of everything he chose not to say for years. And it was about Savannah Guthrie. His colleague, his co-anchor on more broadcasts than either of them could count. A woman millions of Americans had watched laugh, cry, and carry the emotional weight of history alongside him. Or at least, that's what it looked like from the other side of the screen. When word got out, the reaction wasn't just surprise. It was closer to disbelief. Viewers who had watched these two professionals for years suddenly found themselves asking questions they had never thought to ask before. Were things always this layered between them? Was what they saw on screen a reflection of something real? And why, after all this time, was Lester Holt speaking now? Whatever you believed about the relationship between these two iconic figures, hold it loosely. Because what's underneath is far more human, far more complicated, and far more real than anything the cameras ever captured. To understand why this moment carries so much weight, you have to go back. Not just a few years, decades. Lester Holt did not arrive at the top of American broadcast journalism by accident or by luck or by being in the right place at the right time. His path was long. Patient, unglamorous in the way that real dedication almost always is. He started in local news, working through stations in markets that most people outside the industry have never heard of. He learned the craft the hard way, story by story, broadcast by broadcast, mistake by mistake. There was no famous last name making phone calls on his behalf, no inherited opportunity. Just a man with a microphone, a voice that seemed built for this work, and a level of discipline that quietly outpaced almost everyone around him. By the time he arrived at NBC, he had already built the one thing that television chases endlessly and almost never finds: genuine credibility. Not the kind that comes from ratings or awards, but the kind that comes from consistency, from showing up day after day and doing the work honestly. He anchored weekends, he filled in. He waited without complaint, without the kind of quiet industry maneuvering that others in his position often resorted to. While the building around him buzzed with whispers about who was rising and who was fading, Lester Holt simply kept working, kept his head down, kept his name clean. When NBC named him permanent anchor of nightly news in 2015, the people who had watched him earn it, really earn it, felt something close to relief. Like a long overdue correction had finally been made. Savannah Guthrie was on her own rise at the same time, though the shape of it looked very different. Her path came through law before it came through journalism, and when she crossed into broadcasting, she brought something with her that not everyone in that world possesses: an ability to ask hard questions without losing the warmth that morning television demands. She found her place at the center of the Today Show, one of the most watched morning programs in the history of American television. And she held it with a kind of visible confidence that made her impossible to overlook. On paper, on screen, in every public-facing way, she and Lester Holt looked like exactly what NBC wanted the world to see: two gifted professionals, two distinct voices. Together, they covered the full emotional range of what American news could be: his evenness in the evening, her energy in the morning. The public loved that idea. And television networks, when they find something the public loves, are very careful about protecting it. But television, more than almost any other industry in the world, is a place where the distance between what is shown and what is felt can be vast. Beneath the polished handoffs, beneath the warm on-air references, beneath the seamless professional surface, there were things running that cameras can never reach. Pressures that live between people, not in front of them. Tensions that professionals at that level learn very early to contain and never name. For a long time, both of them honored that silence. And then gradually, something began to change. What most people watching from the outside never fully understood about someone like Lester Holt is the sheer emotional cost of the discipline that defined him. Every single day, this was not a man who had the luxury of a bad morning. Not someone who could let frustration show when a story shifted 3 minutes before broadcast, or when information in his earpiece contradicted the script in front of him, or when something unexpected happened live on air, and the entire rhythm of a broadcast had to bend in real time. He absorbed it, all of it, processed it somewhere behind those steady eyes, and then looked directly into the camera and delivered the news like nothing had moved. That takes something out of a person. Quietly, invisibly, over time, those who worked beside him through the years described a man who never raised his voice. A man who handled tension privately, carefully, and without leaving wreckage behind him. His professional identity had been constructed around steadiness so completely that it became genuinely difficult for the people closest to him to know when something was actually wrong. On camera, that made him extraordinary. Off camera, it meant that when something was building inside him, most of the people around him didn't know it until long after the moment had passed. Savannah Guthrie, by contrast, was someone who moved differently through difficulty. She was expressive, emotionally present in a way that read sometimes as strength, sometimes as vulnerability, often as both at the same time. Where Holt turned inward, she reached outward. Where silence was his instinct, words were hers. For a long time, that difference seemed to work. Their professional relationship, as much as anyone could observe it, appeared to function because of that contrast, not in spite of it. But difference, when it lives inside a high-pressure institution for long enough, can change its shape. It can drift from balance into distance. It can quietly become the thing that two professionals politely, professionally, and persistently manage around rather than through. And there were signs for those watching closely enough. Small shifts in tone, subtle changes in how certain appearances were framed, nothing anyone could point to directly, nothing that broke the surface. Just a feeling, the kind that builds in small increments until it isn't small anymore, and still nobody says anything, because saying something is not what people at that level do. Lester Holt certainly didn't, not yet. The years between 2015 and the early 2020s were, by any professional standard, some of the most demanding of Holt's career. He moderated a presidential debate that drew one of the largest television audiences in modern history. He led NBC nightly news through a stretch of national crisis that seemed almost unrelenting: mass shootings, deep political fracture, a global pandemic that reshaped everything, social upheaval that poured into city streets across the country. Every one of those moments asked something of him. Every one of them left something behind that composure alone cannot dissolve. Inside the network, according to various industry accounts from that era, the pressures were reshaping the professional landscape in ways that touched nearly everyone at the senior level. Morning television was fighting for its relevance in a streaming world. The economic certainty that once felt permanent at the top of network broadcasting was becoming something more fragile. Even the most established names in the building were navigating a version of uncertainty that the industry had not experienced before. Savannah Guthrie was moving through her own form of that turbulence. The Today Show, across those years, went through significant internal shifts, co-anchor changes, competitive pressures. The constant challenge of keeping a morning program emotionally alive across years and years of daily broadcasts. It is, by any measure, exhausting work, and the environment around it, according to reports from that period, carried a weight that was not always visible to the people watching at home. What matters is understanding that neither of these people was living in a simple situation. Everything between them, every ease, every tension, every unspoken thing existed inside an institution with its own agenda, its own calculations, and its own idea of what each of them was worth to the brand. And institutions do not always choose the people inside them. They choose the narrative that serves them best. When Holt began to speak years later about what he had witnessed and felt during that stretch, including, according to various accounts, specific frustrations tied to how certain things had unfolded in his relationship with Guthrie, those around him described a man who was not coming from a place of anger. There was no bitterness in how he approached it. What there was instead was something much quieter and much harder to ignore: clarity. The kind that only comes after a very long time of sitting with something and finally understanding it completely. When Holt finally spoke openly, and he did it in the way that is entirely and recognizably him, without drama, without performance, without a shred of the explosive energy that tabloid culture tends to demand from these moments, the public response was almost instantaneous. Because nobody saw it coming, not from him, not in this direction. What he described, according to multiple accounts of what was shared, was not an attack on Savannah Guthrie as a person. He did not go after her character, he did not reach for cruelty. What emerged was something more structural, the way that two professionals, both carrying their own weight, both navigating their own version of institutional pressure, can share a building for years and still exist, in the ways that actually matter in entirely different worlds. That experience of proximity without real connection, of professional warmth maintained at careful distance, is not unusual in large organizations. The separating of talent. The managing of relationships through layers of handlers and intermediaries. The way that competing institutional interests quietly erode what might otherwise become something genuine. All of that is real. All of it was, apparently, something that Holt had felt accumulating for a long time. But the audience reaction said something important. For so many viewers, Lester Holt and Savannah Guthrie had existed together in a kind of imagined intimacy. Two familiar presences in the American living room. Reliable and warm, and somehow connected in the way that people you let into your home every day begin to feel connected. The idea that what lived behind that image was something more complicated wasn't just surprising. For some people, it genuinely unsettled something. Because the question it raised went further than these two people. If that warmth wasn't entirely what it appeared, what else in all those years of watching was also something other than what it seemed? That question, more than anything specific that Holt said, is what moved through the public conversation and didn't stop. The real shock was never about workplace tension between colleagues. The real shock was the reminder, quiet but firm, that television, even at its most intimate, even at its most seemingly personal, is always at some level a constructed thing. There is a specific kind of loneliness that no one talks about, the kind that comes from being exceptionally good at holding yourself together. It means that the people around you rarely know when something is wrong, because you never give them the signal. It means that the professional instinct to manage difficulty quietly, to absorb it, contain it, move past it without leaving a visible mark, can go on long past the point where it is actually helping you. It means that the very qualities that make someone excellent at this kind of work, the patience, the control, the capacity to carry pressure without letting it show, can become, across years and decades, a kind of isolation. Lester Holt has not described it in those terms. But those who knew his professional life closely, who worked alongside him through the long nights and the breaking stories, and the relentless forward motion of keeping a nightly broadcast running through crisis after crisis, describe a man who held a great deal inside for a very long time. His relationship with Savannah Guthrie, according to those familiar with the situation, was never defined by open conflict. There were no confrontations, no moments of public fracture. What existed instead was something slower and quieter, a professional distance that widened gradually, fed by the way the institution around them positioned, supported, and ultimately prioritized each of them differently. Large organizations do this. They make quiet choices about whose needs are centered and whose are managed. Those choices don't usually arrive as announcements. They arrive as patterns, as accumulated small moments that over time form something unmistakable to the person experiencing them, even when they remain invisible to everyone else. According to those who were close to him, Holt arrived at a point where holding all of that inside no longer felt like integrity. It began to feel like something else entirely. Like a story he was telling on behalf of an institution, rather than a truth he was living for himself. When he finally chose to speak, it was not a dramatic act, it was a quiet one. The kind that comes at the end of a very long period of patient, private reckoning, when a person finally decides that the silence has done everything silence can do, and that what is left now is simply the truth. What followed that decision was, in many ways, more revealing than anything Holt actually said. NBC, as institutions almost always do when something sensitive surfaces, said very little. Savannah Guthrie, by all accounts, responded with the kind of composed professionalism that has always characterized her public presence. There were no retaliations, no visible escalation. The surface of the institution held, as surfaces at that level are specifically designed to do. But the conversation beyond the institution, among viewers, among journalists, among people who had spent years watching these two faces and assuming they understood what they were seeing, was immediate and widespread, and it did not quiet down quickly. People went back to old footage. They watched shared segments with different eyes. They listened more carefully to the language each had used when speaking about the other over the years. They began asking broader questions about professional relationships in high-pressure media environments, questions that started with Holt and Guthrie but moved well beyond them. Because what Holt's words had done, careful as they were, measured as they were, was lift a corner of something that most people had never thought to look under. Not just the specific relationship between two colleagues, but the larger, quieter reality of how television constructs the feeling of intimacy, and how completely that construction can diverge from what is actually happening between the people inside it. There is also something worth sitting within the timing of all this. At 66, Lester Holt is not a man at the beginning of something. He is a man with the full perspective of a career that has asked almost everything of him, standing at a point in life where the calculus of speaking and staying silent has shifted entirely. The institutional risk that once made certain things unsayable no longer carries the same weight it once did. And with that shift comes something that younger versions of most people cannot access: the freedom to finally say something honest, not for effect, but simply because it's true. It is worth being clear that no official finding or formal conclusion has been reached regarding any aspect of the professional relationship between Holt and Guthrie. What has emerged is a human account, one person's carefully worded, privately held experience of a long and complicated professional relationship, offered in the language of someone who is not trying to damage anything, only to be honest about what he lived. That distinction carries real weight. It tells you what kind of story this actually is beneath the headline. And what it is at its core is one man's quiet accounting of what it cost him to hold so much together, for so long, without letting anyone see. There is something that stays with you when you sit with all of this long enough. It isn't the professional details. It isn't the institutional politics or the industry pressures, or the specific tensions of working inside a major television network over the span of decades. Those things matter and they are real, but they are not the part that lingers. What lingers is something much simpler and much harder to name. It is the image of a man who spent his entire professional life mastering the art of being present for everyone else, for the millions of people who came to that broadcast every night needing steadiness, needing a voice that made the chaos of the world feel survivable, while keeping the full reality of his own experience somewhere entirely invisible. Somewhere most people never came close to reaching. That is a particular kind of sacrifice, one that rarely gets named for what it is, because when it is done well, it does not look like sacrifice at all. It looks like ease, it looks like calm. It looks like a man who was simply born steady. We ask a tremendous amount of the people we let into our homes through our screens. We ask them to carry the weight of the world's worst moments and return them to us in a form we can absorb. We ask them to remain warm when what they're delivering is devastating. We ask them to be consistent and human and trustworthy, every single day, across years and years of daily presence in our lives. And we offer them in return a kind of love that is real but also partial, the love of people who know a version of someone, not the whole of them. What we almost never consider is the cost of maintaining that version. What it takes day after day to be the person that millions of people need you to be, while the person you actually are lives somewhere quietly behind it. Lester Holt gave the better part of his life to that kind of service, and because he was so extraordinarily good at it, the discipline looked effortless. The composure looked natural. The steadiness looked like it had always been there, like it cost him nothing, like it simply was who he was. The fact that he is speaking now, carefully, without bitterness, without the kind of rage or performance that this kind of story often gets shaped into, is not really a story about conflict. It is a story about honesty arriving late, the way honesty often does after everything else has been tried. It is a story about a man who finally trusted his own experience enough to say, "This is what it was, this is what I carried, this is what it cost." Savannah Guthrie remains, by any measure, one of the defining voices in American morning television. Her career stands on its own. Her resilience, her talent, her ability to sustain years of live broadcasting under real pressure. None of that is made smaller by the complexity of a professional relationship that, like almost every real professional relationship, was never quite as smooth as it appeared from the outside. What Holt's honesty does, more than anything specific it reveals, is remind us of something we tend to forget about the people we watch. They are people. Fully, quietly, sometimes painfully people, carrying things we cannot see, navigating pressures we do not feel, holding together appearances that protect everyone around them, and sometimes, in the process, no one quite as much as themselves. At 66, after everything, the decades of broadcasts, the presidential debates, the breaking news, the weight of history delivered into living rooms across the country, Lester Holt chose to be honest. In the quiet way that honest people choose honesty. That choice says more about who he is than anything he ever delivered on camera. If something in this story stayed with you, if it made you think differently about the people you watch, or the relationships you assume you understand, or the quiet cost of a life lived in full public view, share that thought in the comments. These conversations go deeper than the headlines, and they matter. If stories like this one feel worth coming back for, subscribing is the simplest way to make sure you never miss one. And if someone in your life needs to hear this, pass it along. Thank you genuinely for spending this time here.